Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Daniel Carter didn't know that night would mark the end of everything he believed to be solid. A happy hour with longtime friends seemed like the perfect way to unwind after a stressful week. After a few beers, laughter, and conversations about work, one of his friends pulled out his phone to show something weird he'd found in an anonymous online group. It was the kind of thing that usually circulated among guys like them, full of unfiltered jokes and comments that bordered on absurd. The friend swiped his screen and opened a folder filled with intimate images. The group had gone viral for containing compromising photos of various women, supposedly anonymous. Nobody seemed to take it seriously, until he turned the phone around and casually said, "Dude, this one kind of looks like Lauren." Daniel instinctively glanced at the screen. What he saw took his breath away. The world around him seemed to go silent. His friends' voices faded as if he were underwater. His eyes locked onto the image. The woman lying down, partially naked, with a man on top of her, was in too intimate a position to leave any doubt. He knew that body like the palm of his own hand. He recognized the curve of her hip, the small scar near her rib, the crescent moon tattoo just below her left breast, done during their honeymoon, one night in Cancun after a few margaritas and eternal promises. It was her. Daniel's hands trembled on the table, but he hid them beneath the wooden surface. The friend, sensing the uncomfortable silence, quickly pulled the phone back and awkwardly tried to downplay it. Maybe she just looks similar, right? These photos aren't always real. The other friends noticed something had changed. Daniel just shook his head and stood up, muttering that he had to go. He left without saying goodbye. His half-finished beer stayed on the table, cold and forgotten, just like the last night he'd felt at peace. The drive home was automatic. His heart pounded too fast, his mind boiling. He tried to imagine possibilities, explanations, anything that could make it a misunderstanding. But each image came back stronger. The tattoo. Her gaze. The way she touched the other man. This wasn't fake, nor a coincidence. It was betrayal, raw and blatant. And worse, exposed to thousands of strangers online. When he got home, Daniel opened the door. Lauren was in the living room, laughing at something on her phone, a glass of wine beside her. She looked up and asked how his night had been. He dropped his keys on the kitchen counter and stared at her. Her face looked light, calm, as if everything were fine, as if no tragedy were about to unfold. Daniel pulled his phone from his pocket, opened the photo he'd seen at the bar, and held it out toward her. "Do you recognize this?" Lauren's eyes widened in shock. Her face instantly lost color. For a few seconds, she was speechless, her eyes darting from the image to his face and back again. She tried to smile nervously. "You're joking, right? That doesn't even look like me." Daniel stayed motionless, saying nothing. She stepped closer, trying to grab the phone, but he pulled it away. "Do you really want to lie while looking me in the eyes?" he asked, his voice low but heavy with pain. Lauren took a deep breath. She tried a second line of defense. Said it could be a fake, that these things were common, that several women were being targeted like this. Maybe someone was trying to hurt her. Daniel cut her off. He swiped to the side, revealing another image. Then another. And another. Sequence after sequence. Facial expressions, body details, the tattoo, everything was there. Each photo was another stab in his chest. Lauren's eyes filled with tears. Her voice cracked. She tried to explain, said it was a mistake, that it happened in a moment of weakness, that it meant nothing, that she loved him, that she didn't want to lose their marriage. She dropped to her knees in front of him, begging him to listen. But Daniel had already heard enough. What hurt wasn't just the act, but the time she'd spent smiling beside him while hiding this. What cut deepest was knowing others had seen it before he did. That their intimacy, their marriage, his dignity had been turned into a spectacle in some shallow internet group. Daniel turned his back. He went upstairs and grabbed 2 suitcases. He threw her clothes inside without folding anything. He moved through the drawers like someone exorcising a spirit, yanking out each piece as if it burned his skin. Lauren entered the room, crying, saying there was still time to save the relationship, that they could talk, go to therapy, try to rebuild. He zipped the suitcases shut and dragged them to the door. When he reached the living room, he dropped the bags in front of her. "You chose this. You exposed everything we built. I won't share a roof with someone who tore my trust apart like this." Lauren tried to stop him, grabbed his shirt, fell to the floor begging for a chance. But he opened the door and stood there, waiting for her to leave. When she walked out, eyes swollen and face desperate, Daniel closed the door. Locked it. Leaned against the wood from the inside and finally cried. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of an illusion. And it all started with one image. A single image that, without meaning to, revealed everything hidden behind years of promises. Lauren spent that night in her car, parked on a side street in town, her eyes burning from crying and her phone vibrating with every new message notification she didn't dare open. Her head throbbed, her body ached, and still, she clung to the hope that this was just a temporary outburst from Daniel. She thought he'd open the door the next morning, looking tired but ready to talk. She imagined that years of marriage, trips, plans, laughter, home-cooked dinners would still carry some weight. But time passed, the sun rose, and the door stayed closed. And she understood, he didn't want her there anymore. She tried to reach him. Sent long voice messages, begged for forgiveness, wrote lengthy texts admitting her mistake, saying she'd been confused, that the affair meant nothing. After 2 days with no reply, she showed up at his workplace with tired eyes and a pale face. She covered it with makeup, but the moment someone asked if she was okay, the mask slipped. Slowly, her coworkers' curiosity turned into silent judgment. Rumors started spreading. Someone mentioned an online group. Another said they'd seen something similar. Friendly glances turned into avoidance. Rejection spread like an unstoppable stain. On impulse, she grabbed her phone and called Ethan. Her lover. The man with whom she'd made the mistake that blew her life apart. She expected at least some comfort. When he answered, his voice was cold, flat. She asked if he'd sent those photos to anyone. He said he'd never do that. That he'd deleted everything from his phone. That if she was being exposed, the problem wasn't with him. She pushed, desperate, accusing, asking if he'd been careless, if he'd lost his phone. Ethan got angry. Said it wasn't his fault her life was falling apart. That he didn't want to be involved anymore. And he hung up. The call ended with her heart even more shattered. He was the only person who knew everything, and now he'd turned his back too. But the truth was still coming. That same day, Ethan's wife, Chloe, called him for a serious talk. When he got home, he found Chloe sitting with her laptop open, her face serious, and a folder filled with dozens of screenshots organized in folders labeled by date. They were the same intimate images that had leaked online. Ethan froze. He tried to say those photos had been deleted, that they were private. But Chloe didn't even listen. She said she'd known for weeks. That she hadn't reacted earlier because she wanted to see how far he'd go with the lie. After confirming everything, she planned her own revenge. She created an anonymous profile. Sent the images with cruel captions. Suggested the woman in the photo was an unfaithful wife. A face without a name, but with enough details to spread the scandal. Ethan stood stunned, silent. Chloe didn't change her tone. You ripped our family apart behind my back. I just ripped the rest. The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. Ethan never thought she'd be capable of this. He stayed silent, not knowing what to do. Chloe stood up and said their marriage was over. That she'd already spoken to a lawyer. And that if he tried to clear his mistress's name, she'd make everything even more public. Ethan lost his footing. In less than a week, a secret affair became a scandal with a name, a face, and an address. Lauren, who'd hoped for empathy, was dragged into the middle of a storm she started, but that had now grown beyond anything she could have imagined. That same day, he received one last message from her: "You destroyed me." He didn't reply. He knew replying would be pointless. Nothing he said could undo what had been done. And deep down, he also felt betrayed. Used by her, manipulated by his own wife. Each of them now stood alone in the wreckage of a lie that had exploded in every direction. And the silence between the three of them was the only thing that hadn't yet been exposed. Daniel crossed the Texas-Arizona border driving a rental car, not looking back and not knowing how long he'd stay away from everything. The only certainty was that he couldn't stand being surrounded by memories that only hurt. Every corner of the city he used to live in carried some memory of a marriage he once believed was stable. The supermarket where they argued about which cereal to buy, the cafe where she waited for him on Sunday mornings, the park where they celebrated their 3rd anniversary, all those places had turned into invisible torture, an endless series of small blows he no longer had the strength to endure. Without telling friends, family, or co-workers, he quit his job by email. He wrote just 2 short, direct lines. The HR director replied offering psychological support, saying the doors would stay open if he reconsidered. He didn't even finish reading it. He closed his laptop, cancelled his corporate health plan, cleared his accounts, and left. Flagstaff was a small town, far from the noise of big cities and out of reach of anyone who might recognize him. He found a furnished room in a family-run boarding house managed by a retired couple who welcomed him politely, without asking questions. He paid 3 months in advance and, for the first time in weeks, managed to sleep several hours straight without waking up startled by haunting images. The first week passed slowly. He'd wake up, walk to a quiet local cafe, eat something, return, and sit in silence, staring at the wall. Sometimes he read the news on his phone, but avoided social media. His ex-wife's name still circulated in harsh comments, mean memes, and judgment-filled posts. One afternoon, he decided to look for a job. He needed to keep his mind busy. He walked the streets and entered a small corner bookstore with tightly packed shelves and the strong smell of old paper. He asked if they were hiring. The owner, a man with a white beard named Russell, said he needed help with inventory and organization. Nothing formal, no big demands. Weekly pay, just a few hours a day. Daniel accepted immediately. He spent his days carrying boxes, labeling books, organizing magazines, cleaning shelves, and helping a few customers. He didn't talk much. Answered only what was necessary. The silence inside was a relief. One afternoon, while changing the covers on a display, an elderly woman approached and asked for help finding a self-help book about grief. He searched, handed her the book, and when he noticed her tired expression, she looked at him for a moment before asking if he was okay. Daniel hesitated, but for the first time in a long time, answered honestly. Said he was trying to start over after a major blow. The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret, gently touched his arm and said she'd buried her husband 3 years earlier. She said, contrary to what others claimed, the hardest part of grief wasn't the loss itself, but the silence that followed, when everyone else returns to their routines and leaves you alone with your own wreckage. That conversation, lasting only 20 minutes, deeply affected him. For the first time since leaving home, he felt heard, not judged. Margaret bought the book, thanked him, and mentioned she was part of a small support group that met once a week at the public library. It's not just for people who've lost someone to death. It's for those who've lost in other ways too. Daniel kept that suggestion. He thought about throwing away the card with the address, but ended up leaving it in his pants pocket. 2 weeks later, he showed up at the meeting. He sat in the back, listened to the stories, and stayed silent. The next week, he returned. And the week after that, too. During one session, a woman in her 30s shared that her husband had been having an affair with her friend for 6 months, and she'd found out by accident after seeing a notification on his phone. As Daniel listened, he clenched his hands, swallowed hard, and decided it was time to share his own story. So he did. Without exaggeration, without drama, he simply told the facts, as if opening a wound so air could get in and it could finally begin to heal. At the end of that meeting, several people hugged him, including Margaret. She told him he had strength, even if he didn't feel it yet. That night, for the first time, he wrote in a notebook, "Today I heard myself speak. And I realized that even though the ground was ripped from under me, my voice still exists." It was the first entry of a new chapter. Daniel started going out more, short walks, local markets, talking to booksellers, visiting stalls. Gradually, he built a routine. He still avoided social media and blocked unknown numbers, but he no longer lived in constant pain. He began building a different life, simple, without expecting to become the man he once was, but trying to figure out who he could become after everything he'd been through. The man who'd been betrayed, humiliated, and publicly exposed now worked with books, listened to real stories, and in some way, helped others find comfort too. Time passed, and Daniel continued his new routine in Flagstaff, learning how to live again, with fewer certainties and more care about what he shared with the world. The bookstore job wasn't just a way to pass time, it was also where he rediscovered the value of simple things. He began to know customers by name, knew which books each one liked, and was surprised by how much people opened up when they felt heard. The weekly library meetings continued, and slowly, he went from being a quiet participant to becoming an example for others just beginning their journey of rebuilding. People sought him out after meetings, hugged him in gratitude, and without realizing it, he had become a source of support for people broken into pieces. One ordinary morning, while sorting a stack of newly arrived books, Russell, the bookstore owner, handed him an envelope. He said an older woman had left it at the front desk and it seemed important. Daniel opened it slowly. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Lauren. His ex-wife. The origin of everything he'd tried to erase from memory. The letter was direct. She said she knew the harm she'd caused. She wrote that she'd lost her job weeks after the exposure, let go informally under the excuse of an unsustainable work environment. She said she'd tried to find new opportunities, but every interview ended in silence once her name was typed into search engines. Her image kept being shared, reposted, copied on sensationalist websites. She said her parents had cut contact. Her friends had drifted away. Even people who swore they'd stand by her disappeared after the scandal. Lauren admitted the affair with Ethan had never been about passion. She said she'd felt invisible in the marriage, that she'd mistaken desire for freedom, and that afterward, she'd been living in a reality with no foundation. She mentioned that, for the first time, she understood what regret truly meant, not as fleeting guilt, but as something that settles into your flesh and follows you in silence, like a shadow that never leaves. She didn't directly apologize or beg for forgiveness. The letter was almost a confession. A belated attempt at release. At the end, she said she'd seen him in a short video shared by a friend of a friend, a clip of Daniel speaking at the support group about rebuilding and dignity. She said he looked like a different man, with lighter shoulders and a steadier gaze. She said, in a way, she was happy to see him standing. She ended the letter with a sentence that stayed in his mind for a long time: "You survived what I caused. I'm still trapped in who I've become." Daniel put the letter away, unsure what to think. For hours, he sat still, staring at the handwriting as if each word carried its own weight. At the end of his shift, he took the car and drove to the top of a viewpoint he discovered in his first weeks in town. He sat in silence. Read every line again. And with a calm gesture, folded the paper, placed it inside a wooden box where he kept everything he considered important, closed it, and locked it with a key he wore around his neck. He didn't throw it away. He didn't reply either. Not out of spite, but because he realized some things need to exist only as memory. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.